Hi, and welcome to the fourth video in our series on Word's paragraph group on the ribbon. And today we're going to spend some time with the Dialog Box Launcher, which is in the lower corner of that group. And when we click on it, if you're at all familiar with older versions of Word, you will find an old friend, that paragraph dialog box that has some of the choices that the ribbon has now, but it also has some more fine-tuning options that you may not even realize exist. Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library, and let's get started looking at that Dialog Box Launcher. For our first example today, I have created two paragraphs. The first one is the one that we're going to make changes to, and then the second one is just for comparison so that we can kind of see some of the changes that were made a little easier. And as I click in my first paragraph and go up to the paragraph group in the ribbon, and then go to the far right of that group where we have a box that contains a small arrow pointing down and to the right. That arrow is called the Dialog Box Launcher, and when I click on it, it opens up the paragraph window, and there are so many choices here that there are actually two tabs that sort of categorize the different options. The first tab is indents and spacing, and the second tab is line and page breaks. Well, let's first look at the general group, and we can see that this alignment option left, and if I click on the drop down, also has centered, right, and justified, is exactly the same as the buttons that we already have on the ribbon of left, centered, right, and justified. So if we were already in this paragraph window and making choices, it would make sense to perhaps change the alignment here as opposed to clicking on the buttons. But that's just a choice that you'll need to make as you're working with your document. Below that, there is an outline level choice, and it says body text, which is generally just sort of the default text within a document. And when I click on the drop down, we can see that there are 9 outline levels. Well, the interesting thing about this is that I'm in print layout view. If I define any of these paragraphs that I have as an outline level, they won't show up that way with this view. I actually have to be in outline view for these outline levels to really show up and work well. Because of that, we're going to create another video in the future, the near future, that will explain that outline view and how you can use it to your benefit. So let's come down then to the next group, which is indentation. And it starts with left. And as I look at my ribbon and the paragraph group, I'm reminded that in the upper right of that group, I have a decrease indent and an increase indent. Now the increase indent increases indents by ½ increments. This left indentation will, if I use the little arrows here, and I'll just click the up pointing arrow, actually let me change the indentation by 1/10 of an inch if that's what I need to do. Very much more fine-tuned than the button on the ribbon. Now let me click this up arrow a couple of times. Maybe I'll go past the 0.5 to 0.6, and then I'm going to click OK in the lower right, and we can see compared to the paragraph below that is indeed indented. And of course, because I've indented, I've also had those little buttons that are on the ruler move farther over to the right as well. Well, let me stay clicked in this first paragraph and then go back to my Dialog Box Launcher, click on it, and let's also look at right indentation. Now, right indentation, if I remember correctly, has something to do with quotes that are like a full paragraph or something. Long quotes need to be indented on the left and the right. So in this case, we'll go to, say, 0.5 on the right as well and click OK. And as I look now on the ruler, yes, that little mark has moved in a ½ inch, and you can definitely see the difference between my first paragraph and my second paragraph. So that is really nice, and the thing is, you can move the little button on the ruler, but other than that, the ribbon itself doesn't help you with that particular choice. So let's click again on our Dialog Box Launcher now that we've indented both left and right. And here we also could choose mirror indents, and I'm just going to click on that box for a second. So you can see that if you are creating a document that is then going to be printed double-sided so that you have an inside margin and an outside margin on your pages, that you could mirror these indents so that they look right as you open up to 2 full pages. I'm going to take that off a little bit and we'll click OK. For our next example, I have added 2 more paragraphs that will help us see how those particular options work. So let me click in this new 3rd paragraph and go back to our Dialog Box Launcher in the paragraph group. And we're still in the indentation group though. And on the right-hand side, we have something that says special, and right now it says there is no special indentation, but when you click the drop down here, you have a choice of first line or hanging. So with first line, it indents the first line of the paragraph. It's very similar to how when you were probably in elementary school and taught how to write paragraphs, at least by hand, you always needed to indent that first line. So let's click indent first line, and then the default is a ½ inch, but again, you can change that by clicking on these little up and down arrows. Well, let's click OK. And when I do, you can now see that this first line of this paragraph has been indented a ½ inch, and we can even see that on the ruler by looking at the first line indent, which is at the ½ inch, and then the rest of the paragraph relies on these other icons here, or buttons here on the ruler, to pull them over to the left margin. Well, let's click on our next paragraph and go back to the Dialog Box Launcher and go back to Special. Click on the drop down, and this one is hanging. Now, hanging indents are used a lot with bullets and numbering. So again, when I select hanging, it says by a ½ inch, and let's click OK. Now, this is sort of the opposite of a first line indent, where the first line does not indent and then the successive lines do. You can see how that is set up in the ruler by, again, the first line is on the margin, and then it's the other 2 buttons that work together are the hanging indent. Now, if I click here on my first line and add, say, a bullet, then it kind of straightens everything up. But what you can do, even if you have bullets or numbers that are added, is you can go to that dialog box, and instead of hanging by a ¼ inch, you could change how much it hangs, maybe by ½ inch. And so now I have more space between my bullet and the actual text. Occasionally you'll see something where you even have the bullet and the first line, and then the second line for some reason is just not in the right place. It's more like this. And so if you use that hanging indent, it should fix that and make it all straight here with all the text, kind of with its own inner margin as well. So that is 2 more of the possibilities for our Dialog Box Launcher. As we've worked with the different paragraph examples, have you noticed that there is some extra space between each one of those paragraphs? Well, that is something that is relatively new in the Word world. Before that change was made and made Word kind of more like a desktop publisher, older versions of Word had the same distance between paragraphs as it had between lines of the paragraph. And so what you had to do in those older versions of Word was come to the end of a paragraph and press the Enter key, which of course we do now as well, and then you would press Enter a second time to add in that blank line and then start a new paragraph. But now we simply press Enter once and it automatically adds in that blank space and sets you up to type a new paragraph. So that can be really helpful. Now, just to kind of prove what I was saying, as I select the last line here of the first paragraph, you can see the highlighting that is behind the different text, the different words, but you can also see that there's highlighting here in just blank space that is somehow added to the bottom of this paragraph. Well, to find out how that is added, and for that matter, how much is added, we can go to the paragraph group, go to the Dialog Box Launcher, click on it, and now it says in this spacing group that after each paragraph we want 8 points. Now we might decide that we want less than that or more than that. For example, as I look at my document and I come over to the left where the font group is, I see that my font is actually 11 point, and I might decide that I want this blank space to be 11 point as well. So let me come in here and just take out the 8 and add an 11 instead. Click OK, and you can see that now we've added just a little bit more space to make it 11 point as well. Now, when you are typing, you might find that, say, that 8 point adds just enough space between your different paragraphs that when you get to the bottom of the page, maybe you have a sentence and a half on a second page, and you'd like to kind of compress your text just a bit. Well, what you could do is, in this first paragraph, or rather, you'd really select the whole document, you could go back to your Dialog Box Launcher, and instead of saying 11 point after, you could go down to maybe 6 point and click OK. And it would compress everything maybe just enough that you could actually pull that extra little bit on the second page onto your first page. Now, you might also decide that you would really like to have this have a more solid look to it, more like the older Word documents, and so you'd like to eliminate this extra space, but just simply have the space between the paragraphs be the same as the space between the different lines of the paragraphs. Well, we could do that too, and we can do it a couple of ways. So first way here, I'm going to click in the first paragraph as our example, go to our Dialog Box Launcher, and then where it says after, let's pull that down to 0 point and click OK. And now when I click off, you can see that the line spacing is the same between the paragraphs and within the paragraphs. Well, let me undo because there is another way. We could go back to the Dialog Box Launcher, and right here it says don't add space between paragraphs of the same style. Well, these are the same style. Generally, styles have to do with titles and headings and numbering and bullets, but we definitely have just the same default style. So don't add space, click OK, and now we're not adding that extra space between those two paragraphs. Here is one quirky little thing that you may want to play with on your own as we finish this particular example, and that is we know for a fact that for our first paragraph, when we look at it, that it has 8 points after. And we'll click OK. And we know that our second paragraph has 0 points before. So there should be a total of 8 points between the two paragraphs. Well, let's say that I decide that I want to add some more space, and my idea is that I want to add in more space above the second paragraph. Well, when I do that, let's say that I change this to 6 point before. Now that seems like it should be a total then of 14 point, and with older versions of Word that would be the case. It would combine the before and the after and come up with a new total. But when I click OK here, notice that there was absolutely no change in the position of that paragraph. Now what is funny is if I go back up and let's say that I make it, I don't know, 12 point, and this would be then a total of 20. Let's see, let's click OK, and now it's moved. Now I'm not so sure that that is actually a 20 point change, but it has moved considerably. So now when I look at the 8 point after, and that sure isn't that much different, but it has moved a bit. I'm wondering if it isn't even just sort of a total of the 12 now instead of the 8 plus 12. But this is something that you will need to play with to make sure that the spacing between your paragraphs is what you want. And really, probably the best thing to do is this. Either have all of your numbers either in the before or the after, and whichever one you choose, have the other setting as 0. That seems to be the best way to work with your paragraphs and make sure that you have consistent spacing. For our next example and new little paragraph here, I can see that it is really just single spaced, and that is of course kind of the default standard. But I can come up to the paragraph group and our dialog box launcher and click on it, and I can see just to the right of where we've been looking at the before and after spacing that I can also change the line spacing. Now there is a line spacing button on the ribbon. It's this one with the arrows pointing up and down, just right above the word paragraph here. And so a lot of these choices within our dialog box launcher's window are going to be very similar. Well, let's click on the drop down, and certainly I could change from single to 1.5. Let's click that, and we can see that yes, that widens the lines out a little bit. We could also see in the preview what is going to happen. So let me also click the drop down here and go to double. And so double spacing used to be the standard for papers that were turned in, but let's click OK. And again, we have that double spacing. When I go back to the dialog box launcher, besides double, there is also at least, exactly, and multiple. Well, the at least is there in case you have, say, a paragraph where you mostly have 12-point font. And then there is one line in there that is, say, 8-point for whatever reason. And with that 8-point font, the lines around the 8-point line are going to come together closer than the rest of the lines in that paragraph. So you can say, no, I want this line that has a different size font to have at least the same spacing as the other lines in the paragraph. So this is kind of a very specific kind of instance where that would happen. Now, by the same token, you could say, I want it to be exactly this spacing for the lines in this paragraph. And again, you would probably define that exactly by point size, so it could be 11.2 if that's what you want to do. Now, multiple lets you go beyond double spacing, in which case you could have, say, triple spacing that, some people like to have when they have a very first rough draft, so they can print out their rough draft and have plenty of room to pencil in some changes. So multiple is something that you could do, but again, for very specific kinds of circumstances. I think we'll go back to our, well, let's do 1.5 and click OK. And now we have the spacing that we would like to have with the lines within this particular paragraph. For our next example, I've created a very small paragraph and moved it to the bottom of a page. And let's go to the Dialog Box Launcher here. And you can see that I have gone to the second tab, Line and Page Breaks. And in this first pagination section, you'll find that Widow and Orphan Control is usually turned on, but I've turned it off just so that I can show you an example of a widow and an orphan if you've not seen that. Now, widows and orphans are a page layout rule that is generally accepted, and the idea is that you don't want a widow or an orphan. So I'm going to close out. This is an example of a widow where most of the paragraph is on the first page, and then we've stranded the last line of that paragraph to be the first line on a second page. Well, then let me scroll down here a little bit. And here's the example of an orphan, where the first line of the paragraph is stranded by itself at the very bottom of one page, and then the rest of the paragraph appears on the second page. And the whole idea is that when you write paragraphs, you never strand one line by itself, whether it's a widow or an orphan. So we would need to come back up to the top, go to our paragraph group, the Dialog Box Launcher, and where we have line and page breaks, be sure to turn on Widow Orphan Control to turn off that splitting of the paragraph so that one line is stranded by itself, and then we can click OK. And notice that when I did that, then the widow is now no longer a widow, but all three lines of that paragraph have moved in together. And the same thing here with the orphan, all three of those lines are now together, and you would not be able to type that first line or the last line without Word moving that paragraph to all be together. For our next example, I've added in a little kind of subheading here and then another paragraph, because occasionally what you want to do is make sure that a heading and the paragraph that follows it are connected in some way, so they always move together in your document. Now that might also be a table and say some text, or an image and some text, and you want to keep them together. So what I can do is I can click where I have my little heading and then go to the paragraph group in our Dialog Box Launcher, and what I can say is I want to keep with next and click OK. Now when I do that, I can go to the Show Hide button, which is this button that looks like a paragraph mark, and it's in the very upper right of our paragraph group. And anytime I have keep with next, you can see that there's just a little square here kind of in the left margin showing that these two pieces of information are always going to move together in some way. So now I'm just going to add blank spaces here, but let's see what happens when I get down to the end of a page and what could possibly happen and how this will work with that keep with next. So let me add some blank space here. And what has happened first is that as I've typed in some invisible text, is that that paragraph was long enough that, of course, we're avoiding widows and orphans, but there were two lines here that went to the second page, and then there are two lines that are still at the bottom of the first page, but this title is right there with it. Well, let me scroll down just a tad more, because what I'm going to do is press my Enter key one more time, and it's saying it's okay, but let's press again. And so even though there would have been room for reading time at home on that first page, now, and you can kind of see there's plenty of room, it moved everything together to the second page, because the whole idea is this little heading and the paragraph need to work together. In this next very similar example, I've moved our little heading and last paragraph back to the bottom of the first page. And I'm even going to turn off that keep with next. So let's go to the paragraph group and our dialog box launcher, and I'm going to turn off keep with next and say okay. But notice that there is this keep lines together. Now that's lines within a paragraph together. So we'll say okay. And this time I'm going to select the lines in this paragraph and go to our dialog box launcher and take off that keep with next, turn on keep lines together, click OK. Now I still have that little square, so the keeping things together is going to show that little square icon in the left margin. And now all I need to do is press enter, and as I go down to the second page, notice how all four of those lines move together rather than splitting two and two as they had done before. Now you can use keep together and keep lines together, both together, keep them both checked if that is what you want to do in a certain section of your document. But our reading time at home is still at the bottom of the first page, and the paragraph that we originally thought should go with it is all together on the second page. I have moved our little subheading and our paragraph back to the bottom of the first page because there is something that you might want to do from time to time, and that is to force a page break. In other words, your text goes almost to the bottom of the first page here, but I want to put the page break in early so that all of this information just simply moves down to the second page. And there are several ways that I can add in a page break. There are keyboard shortcuts, all sorts of different things. But if you're working with the paragraph group and you have that dialog box open, you might as well insert a page break from here. So let's go to that dialog box launcher, find your line and page breaks tab, and then one thing that we can do right here, the last part of pagination, is check that box for page break before, and notice that I've clicked just right before the little subtitle here, the reading time at home. Click OK, and it moves reading time at home down to the second page. If I go to the show hide button, again I get a little box showing that I've put in some special kind of information within the coding of the document. And it doesn't even show a page break. Now, if I were here and I did Control Enter, for example, for a page break, it would actually show me through the show hide that I added a page break. But because I've gone with the paragraph groups dialog box launcher and actually made that setting, all I have instead is this little square showing that I've done something special with this particular line of text. For our last examples, I've again placed all of the text sort of in a nice page arrangement here and moved what was at the bottom more where it would belong on a page. But I've also added in line numbering and some hyphenation. Now, line numbers and hyphenation can be found on the Layout tab, and you have several options for those and how you want to handle them. But for us today, first of all, I'm going to go back to the Home tab, and then we're going to go to the Paragraph group and to the Dialog Box Launcher, because as we look at the Line and Page Breaks tab, we can suppress line numbers and we can say we don't want to hyphenate. Again, there are other ways to do this, but if you're in the window here, then this is just a convenient way to find those things. If we want to add in line numbering, and sometimes people do, I've seen this on, say, legal transcripts, for example, or maybe you're collaborating with some people and you decide that the easiest way to discuss certain pieces of the document is to have line numbering. So you can say, well, you know, if you look at line 25 on page 30, then people can refer to that particular spot in your document easier than trying to shuffle through a bunch of pages. So line numbering is very helpful, but we might decide to turn it off or maybe start it here at the second paragraph instead of the first paragraph. So let me cancel out. To remove the line numbering, I need to actually select the lines where I want to suppress that line numbering, and then go back and suppress the line numbers, click OK, and you can see how now the 1 starts with the second paragraph rather than numbering the first paragraph. We can also turn off the hyphenation here, and I added in some words that could be hyphenated and then highlighted them just so you could see them easier. But again, we'll just go to the paragraph group, we'll go to the Dialog Box Launcher, and then we'll say don't hyphenate. Click OK, and you'll notice that because I didn't select it, nothing happened. But if I select the text where the hyphenation occurs, go back to my Dialog Box Launcher and say don't hyphenate, click OK. Now those words are moved down to the next line in their particular paragraphs, and you see the whole word as opposed to a hyphenated word. To learn even more, visit mymcpl.org/online learning, where you will find online resources that include Universal Class, LinkedIn Learning, and Learning Express Library. Be sure to join us each week as we present a variety of tech topics. Each week we premiere 3 new videos. You'll be able to find them at 1 o'clock on Wednesday and Friday, or at 2 o'clock on Tuesday. You can find us on Facebook at MCPL 360, or if you prefer, be sure to subscribe to our MCPL MO channel on YouTube, where you'll be able to find our MCPL Consumer Technology Resources playlist.